If you love Rearview Mirror Chronicles podcast and want to help us keep bringing you brilliant episodes, then please share it with a friend or a fellow history fan who you think might enjoy it. Thanks for your support, and I do hope you enjoy this episode. Hello, I'm Keith Hocton. Imagine a world with no widespread acceptance of the scientific method. A world in which opinions and ideas were shaped by whispers, myths, superstitions, and preachers would now be a thing. Imagine a world where medicine is part prayer and part folk remedy and part something a little darker. Imagine this world dominated by a medieval church with a prescriptive worldview. That is the world that I'm taking you back to today, folks. We're heading back to the Renaissance for this episode to talk about one of the most colorful figures that the Renaissance world ever produced. The Renaissance, to me, is a flourishing time of arts and science, kind of creeping towards modernity. But this is a story about a different Renaissance Europe. This is a story about the magic, the alchemy, the occult, the astrology that gripped people in the Renaissance period. It was a time where our line between science and what they call natural magic was blurred to the point of not existing at all. This is the world of Nostradamus. Nostradamus, in very uncertain times, provided glimpses of the future. I guess a source of guidance. He was an incredible healer. He was a doctor who most famously fought the plague and other diseases. And he had some success, and he did so by embracing some other very modern ideas. And I think if it were not for his later writing career, I think he would have been remembered as an important medical practitioner. But then he set his hand to prophecy. Some believed that he was a complete fake. Others thought that he was insane, and others a heretic. But he became a massive figure of the age. He was effectively protected from the church because he became a favorite of the Queen Catherine de' Medici. She became his biggest fan and invited him to court to look after members of her family and also to do her children's horoscopes. And he made predictions about the future. Some are absurdly vague. Bad things will happen to, France and that kind of thing. And all of them, I think, are open to enormous interpretation. He wrote in a very kind of cryptic fashion, and many of his interpreters have been very generous to him over the centuries, as you'll hear. But plenty of people at the time and since have been impressed by their resonance. I must say, I am a fan of his original and most famous prediction. He actually called the death of the French king, Henry II, husband of Catherine Medici. In 1555, he wrote his book, Les Prophéties, his prophecies, and he wrote, and I'll quote this directly, "The young lion will overcome the older one on the field of combat in a single battle. He will pierce his eyes through a golden cage, and 2 wounds will become 1, and he dies a cruel death." 4 years later, in 1559, Henry II lined up in a jousting tournament against the much younger Count Montgomery. During that joust, Montgomery's lance splintered, and it pierced Henry II's eyes through his helmet's visor. He also sustained a crushing blow to the back of the head as he fell from his horse, so 2 wounds effectively becoming 1. He then suffered terribly for 10 days before dying on July the 10th, 1559, and he dies a cruel death. So Nostradamus's prophecy seemingly is fulfilled, and with that, his career was made, and people have been poring over every word he wrote ever since. And if you're into it, then buckle up, because he saw in our future global thermonuclear war, interstellar settlement, and the sun swallowing the earth. So choose your own adventure there. The world's greatest authority on Nostradamus is a guy called John Hogue. He's written several books on Nostradamus, including Nostradamus, A Life and Myth, and it's a compelling read, I have to say. So let me begin by telling you about the very specific context in which Nostradamus is born and in which he grows up. I'll also talk about his forced conversion and what it was like to be Jewish at this particular point in history. So he's born in 1503 in Provence, and it was ruled at that time, actually since about 1480, by King René the Good. He was called the Good because he was a very enlightened king. And keep in mind that Provence has always been a fantastic doorway to the Mediterranean. Even then, it was a very international place with a very large Jewish population. And the world of Nostradamus, well, it was a beautiful part of the world. But then René's son, the Duke of Calabria, was poisoned, and that dynasty ended. And Charles VIII of France took over and basically said, no more Jews. You either convert or you leave. And then his son, Louis XII, made it very clear that they would suffer severe penalties if they refused to convert to Catholicism. And because they loved living in Provence, they decided to go underground with their Judaism. Outwardly, they were Christians by day. They would attend church. But in the dead of the night, in secret spaces, they would worship as Jews. And the entire community made that decision. Nostradamus actually presented as a Christian, and that allowed him to study and to have a career which would have been completely denied to him as a Jew. And what's interesting, I think, is that so many Christianized Jews ended up being doctors. And interestingly, the best medical university at the time was in Isfahan in Persia. And you can actually study there as a Jew, but not as a Christian. And in fact, there's been an incredible medical facility in Isfahan since the 8th century. And it just reminded me, one of my absolute favorite books is The Physician by Noah Gordon. And that's about a barber surgeon in England in the 11th century who actually pretends to be a Jew to be able to study in Isfahan under the amazing Ibn Sina, who's absolutely a real person, by the way, who wrote the Canon of Medicine. Imagine writing that 1,000 years ago. Anyway, I digress. Nostradamus loved astrology, as did his father and his grandfather, who were his initial teachers at first. And then he went to Avignon to study as a young man. And he was also incredibly passionate about botany. He was actually a proto-botanist, which is why later in life he actually studied under Scaliger, who was one of the best scholars and physicians of his time, who actually revolutionized herbal remedies. And as a young man, Nostradamus actually said, I want to search the world and wander through Paris as an apothecary. Imagine that. So he was a medical man, and he was a very good amateur astrologer. And this is actually very typical of a sort of Renaissance scientific life at this stage. He was a true Renaissance man in the High French Renaissance period. He also dabbled and made cosmetics, and he wrote a book titled The Treatise on Pharmacies and Pharmacists, where he chronicled his journey all over France, through southern Germany and Spain, and then Italy. And he fell completely in love with northern Italy. And that's where he actually bought a lot of his equipment for what he termed his magical study. So during the day, he was a doctor. By night, he was an astrologist and a stargazer. And his interest in astronomy was actually to do with how the movements of these planets and stars affected us here on Earth. I mean, that's incredible when you think about the age. And of course, keep in mind also the church, which was all powerful at the time, actually permitted doctors to use astrology. And this was his way of making his living, and also to use it in his prophecies a little bit later on. And doctors who used astrology called it judicial astrology, what we would call political or mundane astrology today, I guess, reading the world, using the planets to gauge other nations, the lifetimes of nations, people. And that's how he structured his prophecies through a lot of his astrology. The plague at this time was also sending successive waves across Europe, and entire city populations were being wiped out. And this was also something that concerned him greatly. And he was experimenting with herbs a great deal too. Not that there was actually a cure for the plague, because there wasn't, but he obviously had no idea that that was the case. And he also had no idea that it was the fleas on the rats that were causing it. But what he did care about was the suffering of the people. And the great outbreak that happened during his time was in 1546-47 in Lyon, and it was incredibly severe. So he was actually asked by the city fathers to go there and to help them, because all the doctors had either fled or they died. So he set up with a couple of apothecaries in the Hotel de Ville, and for the next 270 days, he fought the plague almost single-handed. And the main thing that he did, he was incredibly big on hygiene, clean water, fresh food, washing his hands. Any food that was left out was immediately disposed of, not left around, nothing that would effectively attract rats. And he knew that there was something to do. There was a connection between the plague and rats. He also stayed 6 feet away from people when they came to see him. And more importantly, he's one of the first recorded men to wear a mask when he saw patients. Everybody had an idea that hygiene was important, and everybody kind of knew that when there were no rats, there was no plague. So he also set up rat gangs to kill the rats. He also developed a rose lozenge that he gave people. Rose lozenge, can you imagine? And people actually liked it, because he cared enough to give that to them. A small thing, a placebo, if you like, just to help people. He also told people not to gather in groups, to self-isolate, and these were incredibly radical things in those days. So he's doing some really interesting progressive things. I then wondered if he was famous at this stage because of his medical work. Is he celebrated? And here's the thing, he actually is. If Nostradamus had never, ever written a word of prophecy, I think he would have gone down as one of the most famous plague fighters in history. What he did in Lyon was just extraordinary. And he literally went from town to town after that, continuing his work. And when that plague finished, when that was done, he was again summoned back to Lyon to battle whooping cough. So, you know what? He's building a name for himself as a medical man. But I'm also presuming that a large part of his medical work also included the occult. And this had to have also been condoned by the church and the French elite. So the term occult then actually meant hidden, or someone who kind of works, not someone who works in the shadows, but someone who doesn't actually share their secrets. So it's also been a thread throughout all periods of history. And the Renaissance was an interesting crossroads where, classical knowledge was being regenerated. That's what the Renaissance means. And so all things of, the classical Roman or the Hellenistic world, or even the Middle East, was also included in that mix. And of course, one of the things that happened that was open in times of Rome and the times of ancient Greece were seers. The Oracle of Delphi was a mainstream thing. So it wasn't a hidden thing. So it has a history, I think, of a long legacy of resistance to the reactive Christian conversions of things that specifically want to suppress it. And when you suppress something, it only makes it stronger, but it also then makes it secret. And fundamentally, this is what the occult sciences are. They were pursued, as was alchemy, during the Renaissance. But alchemy actually played it interestingly. Alchemists kept people at bay by outwardly saying, we're actually trying to make base metal into gold. And what they did by saying that was they played on the greed of the unconscious people, the royals, all the way down to the peasants, because everybody was interested in turning metal into gold. But realistically, that was actually all smoke and mirrors. What alchemy really was a mystical group that were actually taking the base metal of your ego, of your subconscious, of your lower ideas, and they were turning that into the gold of enlightenment. So alchemy was actually all about the soul and not about making gold from base metals. Effectively, it was about becoming the potential that every soul has. So Nostradamus is dabbling in the occult, but sort of keeping it on the down low. But then he publishes his prophecies. And I wondered then what led him to publish that book. His journey to becoming the most famous prophet in the world actually started with this quatrain that he foresaw, in 1554, the jousting accident and the details of what happened to the king, which was actually the cause for the wars of religion, which were why he was writing these prophecies in order to try and prevent it. So what happens is the Book of Prophecies ends up on the desk of the Queen of France. And as I said, the Queen of France was a Medici. And it so happened that she was deeply involved in occult study. So she had basically got the king to advise the royal censors that she should be on that board and that no book, no matter what the subject, could be published in France unless the king's censors approved it and stamped it. So every single book had to go through her first. She would be the first person to read it. So when you think about that, the first person to read the prophecies of Nostradamus was her. And the first thing that she sees, not that long into it, was quatrain 35 of century 1. And she thought that this was about her husband, King Henry II. And it starts by saying, "The young lion will overcome the old one on the field of combat in single battle. He will pierce his eyes through a golden cage. 2 wounds made 1. Then to die a cruel death." And let's just take a short break for a message from our sponsor. Nostradamus is your one-stop shop for your Malaysia My Second Home visa. But they are much more than that. When you sign up with Nostradamus, you become part of a larger community, a community that cares about you in Malaysia. And that's important when you move to a new home. So for more information, call Nostradamus or WhatsApp them on +60 12 493 7270 or visit their website www.penangmyhome.com. And we are back. So the young lion is the Count of Montgomery, Gabriel de la Sueur, and he's attending this joust, and the joust is actually a big deal, and there's members of both the French and the Spanish courts, and they were there because they were celebrating a peace treaty that had ended the Italian-French wars. And they were also deciding on who would marry who to cement the royal families, and usually a joust like this would last up to 3 days. So it was the end of June in 1559, on the last day, just as the sun was setting, and Henry II wanted one last joust. He wanted one last go at triumphing over the Count of Montgomery. They charged 20 miles an hour, 30 miles an hour, 2 massive horses carrying 2 fully armored knights, Henry II and the Count of Montgomery. And just before they clash in the middle, they lower their lances. And Montgomery has a problem. He struggles with his jousting stick, and as they meet, it hits the king in the chest and splinters and slides up and passes through the gilded cage of Henry II's helmet, piercing him right through the eye, whereupon he falls from his horse with this massive splinter lodged in his eye. And of course, you can imagine the scene. Everybody was screaming. Henry's drenched in blood. The Queen faints. And somehow he still manages to get to his feet before he's helped by his aides. He's then rushed to bed in the Chateau Thornel, and his private physician, Gabriel Padre, tries to save him. The splinter had pierced so far back, it actually touched the fracture of his skull, the one that he got when he fell from his horse. Well, that then became infected, and 10 days later, he died in agony. What then happened that night was that a great mob gathered outside Paris, and they went to the Roman Inquisition's offices, and they were carrying effigies, and they were demanding that Nostradamus be arrested and that he be burned at the stake. Fortunately for Nostradamus, he was already 300 miles away in Provence. So Nostradamus becomes super famous literally overnight because what he's done is he's prophesied the king's death. What had actually alerted Catherine even more was that the Medici family back in Florence actually had their own astrologer, and he was very well respected. He was a guy by the name of Luke Garricus, and he'd also written to her in a message months before of his concern when he'd been looking at the stars. He'd seen signs that told him that Henry II might possibly find himself in 1559 in an accident whilst jousting. And what he said to her is, don't let him joust, or don't let him joust this year. So hundreds of miles away in the south of France, Nostradamus is also writing about it. And of course, way off in distant Florence, there's another great prophet of the era is also writing about it. And of course, the two never knew each other. They weren't in contact with each other then. So that's quite the coincidence. But what she gets is a letter from the Medici family astrologer in Florence, and then she reads it in Nostradamus's book. So she immediately sends him a letter demanding that he attend her and the king. Immediately. Now, it usually took 3 or 4 months for anybody to rise a horse or, a bumpy carriage to get to Paris from Provence. But she made sure that this is how important this was to her, that he had the royal livery, their best stallions, to harness the coach. And they had him there within a month. So he arrives in Paris and he goes immediately to the Ile-de-France and he prays, and then he goes back to his hotel where he meets with his publishers, who are incredibly concerned that he's been called to meet with the king and queen. And they think, and he thinks, that he's about to lose his head. So he meets with them, and then the following morning, he's about to have his audience at the Palace of Saint-Germain, which was just outside Paris at that time, and he has a knock on the door. And he opens the door to his hotel room, and there is the Constable of France, no less, who was actually in a lot of Nostradamus's prophecies, where he talks about his future and the fate, during the wars of the Revolution between the Catholics and the Protestants. And this guy is an imposing figure. Everybody knows him in France. He's incredibly famous, and he's a big, strapping man. He's about 6'2", and he's about 70 years old, but he looks probably 40 or 50. And this is the man that commands all of the forces in France. And he's there. This is how important they think Nostradamus is. He's there to take him to the palace. So they get him to the palace. The palace is crowded with people, petitioning the king. And Nostradamus gets taken by all these people, and they're sneering at him, looking down on him, as most people did on physicians and seers during that time. But he was an incredibly polite man. He always was, always would be throughout his life. And, he kind of greeted everyone and kind of waved embarrassingly and said hello. Meets with the king and the queen. And not only does he come out with his head on his shoulders, he comes out with several hundred gold coins. Now, this was effectively to pay or help pay for his journey there. But of course, it didn't pay for his entire journey. And this was the thing. Even though they demanded to see him and they'd sent their livery, he had to pay for it. So he then had to do astrology readings while he was in Paris to pay the rest of the bill to effectively get himself home. But what happens about a week or two after him being there is that he's actually invited to the Chateau Bois in the beautiful kind of Bois countryside, which was the summer retreat for Catherine. And there he's introduced to her children. He draws charts. He draws astrology charts for all of them. It was said that he actually got on with Margot the best, and she actually ended up being Lauronne of Valois and queen consort of Navarre, which he had also predicted while doing her chart. Incredible stuff. So now that we're talking about the prophecies, let's just have a look at some of the other prophecies. I then wondered about which ones have actually come to pass. So one of the more interesting ones for me is a prose prophecy, which he wrote in March 1558. And in this, he actually sees the French Revolution coming. He called it the advent of the commoners. So keep in mind he's a royalist through and through, but he tells Henry II that there would be a great persecution of the Christian church when this happens, and that churches would be closed down, and that the royals would be taken and executed. And he also says that it's a new era, and that they'll create a new calendar, and it would be in the year 1792. Now look, he's a little bit wrong about the churches being ransacked. That happened a few years earlier, but the First Republic did create a revolutionary calendar in 1792. So he absolutely nailed that one. People also like to think that he predicted the atomic bombs, and the most quoted quatrain is number 6. And basically he says, near the gates and within 2 cities there will be 2 scourges, the like of which was never seen. Famine with plague, people put out by steel, crying to the great immortal God for relief. He went on to say that there would be a terrible scourge that would hit 2 harbors. And he was absolutely horrified by this. And of course, it's also some of his future prophecies that say we're not out of danger yet. He talks of, great flying fleets that use the dreadful globes. And that's interpreted as a trigger, a fission trigger. And he goes on to say that fires will march up from the south. So the interpretation of that would be south going north on both the American and Russian territories. And there was the one that predicted 9/11. And while he never explicitly mentioned the event, the verse kind of appears to describe a disaster involving tall towers, fire and attacks from the sky. And it's in Century 1, Quatrain 87. And what it says is, earth-shaking fire from the center of the earth will cause tremors around the new city. 2 great rocks will war for a long time, and then Arethusa will redden a new river. Okay, so you have to remember that during his age, during the time that he wrote this, language and speech, and certainly the written language was very, very different to the way that we write or speak now. But the interpretation of that is where he talks about earth-shaking fire. Well, that's obviously massive explosions, by planes hitting the 2 towers. The new city is interpreted as New York City, and the 2 great rocks as the Twin Towers. The last bit, Arethusa, will redden a new river. Well, that's easy. It's just a poetic way of saying that bloodshed and destruction will follow the attack. Look, it's not conclusive, I grant you. But then in Century 6, Quatrain 97, he says, at 45 degrees the sky will burn, fire to approach the great new city. In an instant, a great scattered flame will leap up, when they will want to have proof of the Normans. So I think what's really kind of interesting about that is that there was a fake Nostradamus 9/11 kind of quatrain that came out literally right afterwards. And what that said was, in the year of the new century and 9 months, from the sky will come a great king of terror. The sky will burn at 45 degrees. Fire approaches the great new city. Now, that was completely made up straight after the attack to make it look like he'd actually predicted the 9/11 attack, which really just added myth and allure to his already massive, kind of reputation. So I then wondered, apart from his prediction of, Henry II, which actually came to pass in his lifetime, what was his next famous prediction? And again, it's tempered with interpretation, but I suppose it's the Great Fire of London in 1666. So in Century 2, Quatrain 51, he says, the blood of the just will commit a fault at London, burnt through lightning of 23s, the 6. The ancient lady will fall from her high place. Several of the same sect will be killed. So the Great Fire of London actually broke out in 1666. And what he says is 23's the 6. So the math on that is 1,000 plus, 20 times 3 plus 6, and you get 1666. The ancient lady, well, that can only be interpreted as St. Paul's Cathedral, which did actually burn down to the ground, as well as hundreds of other small churches. So let's come to what he thinks about our future. So, nuclear war, excellent, great news. But he also wrote about extraterrestrial colonization and leaving this planet. And he says that sometime around the year 3797, which is actually his last dated prophecy, he said that there's going to be a great conflagration where mountains will be destroyed, the oceans will be destroyed because the sun is devouring the earth. And effectively, what he's saying there is that the earth will become a red giant. He then says that the races of man will move towards Aquarius for a period of time, and others will move to Cancer. So he's basically saying that in the future, we're going to live on new Earths that are actually orbiting the stars of Cancer. So that's actually quite a remarkable prophecy, given the time as well. So it's the prophecies that actually make him famous and why we remember him now. But I then wondered, how did he spend the last few years of his life? What I discovered was that he was actually kind of healthy and hearty, right up until the end. In his last 2 years, he declined, rapidly. He effectively had what's known as dropsy, which is a pulmonary edema. And I think he knew that his time had come. He also had very bad gout in his leg, and it was incredibly painful for him. And it was severely swollen, so severely swollen that they actually had to build him a small bench in his bed so that he could actually keep it raised. And they had actually moved his bed and this little bench up into his beloved study because that's where he wanted to be. So in early July, as he said goodbye to his secretary, who was the last person to actually see him, as the secretary left, he kind of waved goodbye. Nostradamus says, "You will not see me alive again." So at dawn the following morning, his secretary creeps up there and he finds him on the floor between the bed and the bench, dead as a dodo. Which actually then brings me to the final prophecy of Nostradamus, which said, "On his return from the embassy, the king's gift put in place," so obviously some business that he was doing for Charles, "he will do no more, he will be gone to God. Close relatives, friends, brothers by blood, will find him completely dead near the bed and the bench." Now, maybe he felt it coming and I don't know, he kind of rolls off the bed, to fulfill this prophecy. I don't know. We'll never know. But he certainly seemed to be able to predict his own death and where he would actually be found. The last bit of prophecy that he actually wrote, he says about the world that he's leaving, he said, "It's a sad state will be. All states and sects," so I think, he's clearly talking about the wars of religion, "between brothers and sisters, amenity, discord, and civil war will presume." And then his last line is, "The summer arid, this line to expire." So after his son Caesar and his uncles die, Nostradamus' bloodline also dies. So what's his legacy? Prophet, poet, or plague fighter? He remains one of the most fascinating and controversial figures in history, effectively celebrated by some as a seer who predicted major world events and dismissed by others as a clever poet whose vague verses can almost be applied to anything. What you can say for sure, though, is that his legacy continues to thrive in books and films and obviously conspiracy theories and modern interpretations of his quatrains. Well, you know what? I dare say they will continue for another 500 years. Thanks for listening in, folks, and I'll look forward to chatting to you next week. Bye for now.